Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, he's been described as a giant of democracy, a fearless freedom fighter, and one of Kenya's most influential and enduring political figures. Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister who has died at the age of 80. It marks the end of an era for a towering Pan-Africanist and leaves a significant void in Kenya's opposition ranks. He never became president, running unsuccessfully 5 times, but he was hugely influential across sub-Saharan Africa, a political leader of singular significance whose long career was marked by resilience, defiance, and sacrifice, attracting lots of admiration at home and abroad and inspiring a generation of politicians. He became prime minister for the president who essentially beat him in the presidential race, following an election that very nearly plunged Kenya into civil war. But as prime minister, he was able to introduce a new constitutional order that altered Kenya's political landscape. His last major interview was given to this program in July during his visit to Nigeria. Let's take a listen to a short excerpt from that interview.
Well, those 5 times, you could divide it this way. The first time, I was just introducing myself to the country. I didn't expect to win at all. The second, which was my really serious challenge, I won the elections, and everybody knows it. And it was, of course, massively rigged. And that resulted into a contest and a violent protest by the people of Kenya, which resulted in a bloodshed.
We saw that.
And there was international intervention. The international community then sent the former U.S. Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who came to Kenya to mediate and broker peace, ending up with the formation of a grand coalition government, which we shared on a 50-50 basis for 5 years. The election thereafter was again contested, and of course the results were disputed. And our petition was thrown on the grounds that our evidence was filed late, after according to the judges, that the time had elapsed.
And that's Raila Odinga talking to me just 3 months ago in July. And to help us look back at his life less ordinary, I'm joined now on the line from Lagos by the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, Professor Eghosa Osaghae. And here in Abuja, I'm joined by the international multimedia journalist and former BBC correspondent, Donu Kogbara, and by the managing editor of the Africa Report, Africa's best read source of continental news and analysis, Nicholas Norbrook. Gentlemen and lady, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me come to you first, Eghosa, Professor in Lagos. A towering figure in Kenyan politics, yet he never achieved his dream of becoming president. I mean, he ran 5 times, and each time he rejected the results, often saying that victory was stolen from him. In that sense, was he typical or untypical of the African politician?
Well, you can say he was both. The point really is you don't have to be president to make the kinds of contributions that would make democracy such a wonderfully beautiful process. And I think, for the years that Raila Odinga, led as leader of opposition in Kenya, he kept the government in check. So that is a critical democratic role. And today we can look back and say, yes, he contested 5 times, he lost elections 5 times, but see the things that followed those losses. He was an advocate and a champion of electoral reforms. In one of the cases that he took to the Supreme Court, he talked about the failures of the electronic process in the voting process of that year. And that led to several of the reforms, even in the Electoral and Boundaries Commission of Kenya. Now, another time, he challenged the issues that were raised by power sharing that led him to becoming the prime minister of the country, a position he held for 5 years. Now, but I think the key point was that finally he got the Supreme Court to rule that the election be annulled, and yet went ahead to say on grounds of principle, because the reforms did not suggest that the Electoral Commission was ready for a free and fair election, he refused to take part in that election. Now, so I see that there are those whose major contributions would be seen not in terms of what they achieved as people who were in government, but what they did outside of government. And I think one of the lessons from the Kenyan case is you need very effective government, but you also need very effective checks and balances, the kinds of things that are guaranteed by strong opposition.
Right.
And so in all of those years that he led the opposition in Kenya, this is what Raila Odinga demonstrated.
Well, thank you for setting that out for us. Let me come to you, Nick. His fiercest battle came in 2007, didn't it? When disputed results sparked those nationwide sort of protests, the violence, which eventually led to a power-sharing deal brokered by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. How pivotal a moment was that?
I think he deserves a lot of credit for stepping back from the brink. He really was the architect of that peace-sharing moment and accepted, you know, the lesser role of Prime Minister for the greater good. And I think every single Kenyan would put up their hand and say, had that not happened, the country really was staring into the abyss. So that was a huge role he played. I would agree with everything the Director General has said. It's very different just turning up every 5 years and competing in an election versus, you know, spending the 1980s in jail or spending the 1990s in vigorous opposition against quite a brutal regime and helping to birth the end of the Moi era. And even though critics, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, you know, say he's maybe better known more recently for compromise with power rather than standing up to it, I think if you take the course of his career, the ledger is definitely on the positive side.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. And Donu, I think something else that many people admired about him was his staying power, wasn't it? Because despite successive election setbacks, he was able to rise up again and again. And that inspired lots of people, didn't it?
Well, it certainly did. I mean, he was like the proverbial phoenix, always rising from the ashes. And, you know, this is a man who never gave up. Definitely to be admired. I think it's already been said he ran 5 times, and he was so popular with his political base that one of his nicknames was Act of God. And so he had this enormous capacity for...
The other one was Baba, which was father, which is called father, yeah.
Yes.
He was known as a sort of father figure, wasn't he?
So he had this capacity for sort of like energizing the masses. I mean, in 2007, about I think they said 1,200 people...
Yeah, 1,300 people.
Yes. Died, and 600,000 were displaced from their homes. So this is a man with tremendous residual power. And yet somehow he had the generosity of spirit, if you like, to never take it to the bitter end. He always found a way to compromise with the system so as not to break it completely. I'm not always sure, you know, as you know, I can be a bit radical. I'm not sure that every system should be preserved. But I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that this was a mature man who never wanted anarchy.
Yeah. Well, let's listen to another clip from that interview I had with him on this program in July. And here he's talking about the motivation, or what motivated him to keep running.
I would say that I don't have to run. But then I have got people around me, supporters, who have been urging me to run. Because I think they think that I am the one at that moment in time with the best prospect of winning the elections. And I have also said that I am there for the people. If the people want me to run, I'll run. And if the people don't want me to run, there's no reason why. I can support somebody else, and I have done so. You remember in 2002, there were about 7 presidential candidates. And I told him that we needed to agree to front only one of us. I was the first to withdraw, but the others were reluctant to withdraw. In the end, I'm the one who actually proposed Mr. Kibaki.
Yes, Mwai Kibaki.
Mwai Kibaki. I said Mwai Kibaki should be our candidate because he was the senior most at that time. He had been vice president for a long time. And we said that let us form Mwai Kibaki so that we, at least for the first time, opposition can win. Therefore, we said it does not have to be Raila Odinga. I'm always ready to support somebody else.
Right. Raila Odinga there. Let me come to you, Professor Osaghae in Lagos. What do you think his death means for the future of Kenyan politics?
A lot, I would say. First is, you see, he had very strong roots nationally and provincially and even at the community level. He had the resilience, that many of our politicians lack, for the simple reason that I think his driving force, his major motivation was to see a better Kenya. And remember that, he had served in government in different positions. He was minister. And at the time when the pro-democracy movement started, in the heydays, the final years of the Moi government, he joined forces with other opposition elements to form what was then called Ford. And never mind that over time, Ford split into Ford Kenya and Ford Asili. But over the years, it's been proven that Kenya, with people like Raila Odinga and Peter Anyango Yongo, were able to sustain, the drive for democracy and the deepening and the consolidation. So that in a very real sense, when today Kenya is celebrating its dividends and progress made in the trajectory of democracy and democratization, I think Raila Odinga will feature very prominently, which is why in his Luo group, he has many praise names. One of them is that he's a mysterious man. Another is that he's chairman, something that I'm sure that those of us in Nigeria can easily relate with.
Yes,
but,
indeed.
He had a great deal of charisma, dating back to his father's days and so on. So I think that, Kenyan democratic struggles would remember him for all of this.
Indeed. And Nick, let me come to you. There really hasn't been any political figure in Kenya who has stepped up to inherit his mantle, has there? I mean, no one appears to have the capacity, I think Donu touched on that, to mobilize opposition forces the way Raila Odinga has. I mean, so how much is his passing likely to really alter Kenya's political landscape and reshape opposition politics in that country?
For someone who was really able to build, I think, probably the most coherent national party in the last 20, 30 years in Kenya, and keep support at around 50% during that time, he wasn't very good at promoting talents from within who might overshadow him. And so, especially in these final years, it's been very tough for the Kenyan opposition really to find itself. I guess the nadir was earlier this year when He gave his support to President Ruto, who you will remember has been on the ropes politically since the big protests against his unpopular finance bill last summer. For Raila to have reached out and done another of his handshakes and given some of his popularity to this very, very unpopular regime really disenchanted many of the youth who were his natural supporters. So with his passing, it's now a huge blank screen for the Kenyan opposition to project onto. We have elections coming up in 2027. I imagine President Ruto is sighing a great sigh of relief. However, if the Kenyan opposition can coalesce around one candidate, we'll see.
Indeed, and Donu, as Nick said there, of course now more so than ever, the country preparing for what is being seen as a very competitive election just 2 years from now. So the issue of who takes over, that's a lingering question for political observers to ponder, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is, and I think that's a problem with African politicians generally, in this country as well. I mean, having sort of coherent succession plans, allowing people who are as clever as you are to sort of, and tutoring them and nurturing them and mentoring them. It's not something that I've noticed African politicians are very good at, and that makes opposition parties quite weak. Because, like I said, there doesn't seem to be any succession plan. It's always about, not particularly liking people who are good enough to take over from you. But I mean, this is a man who was Kenya's longest serving political detainee. I always admire people who are willing to go to prison for their beliefs, who are courageous enough to risk their lives even for their nations. I think, so you have to balance the fact that he was a hero in that way, but not particularly generous of spirit in the other way. Right. In my opinion, it is a problem that there's no one we can point to and say, okay, he's next.
Right. Yes, I think that's a good point that you make. Let's take a brief listen to another short final excerpt from that interview I had with him right here on Prime Time during his visit to Nigeria in July. This is Mr. Odinga talking about Kenya's future and possibly running again. Of course, he didn't know he was going to be, dead. So he was talking about the possibility of running again. Let's take a listen.
I'm not going to run because, as you know, I lead a political party, and I have to consult my political party so that the movement survives even without me. So I've said that Kenya should be led by people who have got a clear mandate of the people. And this can only come if the electoral process is really fair, so that the voice of the people is reflected in the outcome of elections.
Raila Odinga there. Professor Osaghae in Lagos, of course, beyond running for president, he was seen as a Pan-Africanist, and at one stage he wanted to be chairman of the African Union and to use that position to push for integration across the continent. But alas, he also lost that attempt to chair the AU, didn't he? As briefly as you can, because we've got just about 3 minutes left to round off this discussion.
But most certainly, he would also be remembered as a great Pan-Africanist. Remember that he had served as a high representative on infrastructure for the AU. It was quite a loss, I think, to the continent of Africa that he didn't make it to be chairperson of the AU Commission. But, just as he did when you hosted him about 3 months ago, he always demonstrated the strength of character that lies in Pan-Africanism. And it's not for nothing that Kenya was one of the first African countries to embrace, reforms in its visa policies. You can say it was both. So the point really is you don't have to be president to...
I'm not quite sure where that is coming from. there's a bit of an infiltration there. But, well, in any case, let me, while they sort that sound out, let me come back to the studio in Abuja here and come to you, Nick. What do you think his legacy will be, not just in Kenyan politics, but in the influence he had beyond his home country?
I mean, I'd like to borrow from the great Kenyan scholar Ken Opalo, who did a great piece on his Substack today, and he really divided up modern Kenyan history since independence into three eras: Kenyatta, Moi, and Odinga. Odinga really from, the early 2000s until today, that is an era, and scholars and the public will look back and say this really was the Odinga era. He shaped generations of political thoughts. He had a spine, he had a real political backbone, and I think that will be brought forwards. And he really was someone who helped move Kenya on from debates around ethnicity towards debates on ideology, and that has to be a positive thing.
Indeed. And for you, Donu, how do you think he'll be remembered?
Well, I agree with Nick, who, by the way, is my editor at the Africa Report magazine.
Of course, you write for Africa Report,
Yes.
as well as all the other things you do.
Yes. And what I would say is that I would like to remember Odinga as a chip off the old block. His father was quite a sort of towering figure also, who walked out of the great Jomo Kenyatta's government. And I'd like to remember him as a reformer. He had a huge impact on the electoral reform movement in Kenya. And again, bringing it back to home, I wish we would have someone who could push for the sort of reforms and improvements that Odinga managed to trigger in his own country. May he rest in peace.
Indeed, amen. And on that note, I want to thank all of you very much indeed. Donu Kogbara, who is the international multimedia journalist and former BBC correspondent, and of course writes for the Africa Report, and Nicholas Norbrook, who is the managing editor of the Africa Report, and Africa Report, of course, Africa's best read source of continental news and analysis. And from our studios in Lagos, the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, Professor Eghosa Osaghae. I do apologize for that interruption as you were speaking there, Professor, but thank you very much indeed.